You said yesterday, at one point, something like, living in a state of unknown is wisdom. And you're also often talking about universal consciousness. Can you talk about the relation between these two terms, if it's possible, or if there is one?
What I meant really, when I said to live in the unknown, I didn't mean to unknown everything we know, like how to drive, how to speak languages, how to cook, and etc. Right? I was saying that in a very specific, with a very specific meaning, not to know what we are. We can know anything else, but not knowing what we are. If we know what we are, everything we know is limited. Therefore, if we know what we are, we limit what we are.
So that means I cannot even know, if that is the case, that I'm unlimited consciousness, in that sense.
Yes,
okay.
With the mind, we cannot know consciousness. So when I use the word unlimited consciousness, it is simply a tool I use to deconstruct the belief that consciousness is limited. But in fact, it's neither limited nor unlimited, because only an object can be limited or unlimited. But in order to deconstruct belief systems that have been created in the mind, by the mind, we use the mind. In the Indian tradition, they compare that with a thorn, which is used to remove a thorn that has entered the skin. When the thorn has been removed, the thorn that was used for the removal is thrown away because it is no longer necessary or useful. So that's... So the experience, when we believe that consciousness is limited, as universal consciousness, we choose this belief because we believe that in the total absence of evidence that it is the case. Therefore, it's optional to believe that way. Therefore, this choice comes out of our freedom as universal consciousness. And in a sense, this choice we made as universal consciousness gives an order to the universe to behave that way. At least from the vantage point of this body-mind with which we choose to identify at that moment. So this universal intelligence is going to organize the phenomena in the world in a way that is going to be consistent for this specific body-mind with which consciousness has chosen to identify, will be consistent with For instance, some amount of freedom, but a very limited amount of freedom, of choice, and also seemingly consistent with the localization of consciousness in this object, in this body-mind. So here is a connection between universal consciousness and not knowing. If we know what we are, the universality of consciousness remains veiled for us. If we don't know what we are, we allow for consciousness to be whatever it is, and it is universal, and therefore to reveal its universality in the flow of things. So that's a connection between not knowing what we are and the revelation of the universality of consciousness.
Namaste, friends. In the path, for example, during the meditation, I'm struck and I'm asking you regarding that. So once I start being quiet in the mind, so I'm left with this voice or narrator or whatever.
With what?
With the voice or the narrator,
The voice of the narrator?
Voice or the narrator, I don't know what, the same voice through which I'm speaking to you, that one is is still there, and the vision, although I close my eyes, still that vision or the perceiving thing, I don't know what you call that. So those two are still there, and sometimes thoughts will come up, but even if I'm able not to see these things, these two things are still left, the vision and the voice or the narrator, which is trying every time. So I don't know, beyond that,
what is the difference between that and a thought? Isn't it true that when we think, we never think in abstract terms? We think in a way which is similar to the senses. In other words, we hear a voice, or we see the words written, or we see an image. You see, so we don't think in an abstract way. In other words, we don't, by abstract way, I mean without any phenomenal support. The only time when any phenomenal support disappears is at the moment of understanding. The moment of understanding is a moment when any representation, be it a sound, be it an image, be it something else, but phenomenal, all of that vanishes, and we are left with consciousness alone. So the understanding takes place in consciousness. I mean, everything, but the understanding takes place in the absence of representation in consciousness. In a sense, at that moment we leave the mind, or to be more precise, the mind leaves us, insofar as the mind is made of representations. So in the absence of representation, there is pure consciousness, and then the intelligence shines.
So I know that I cannot do anything, but I'm just still asking, so what should be done from my part, in the sense? I'm struck there is what
the most important thing is understanding. Because as I have just tried to show to you, that the real experience of pure consciousness is the experience of understanding. because at that moment there are no representation. So really, now there are two forms of understanding. There is understanding about a form, if you want, Namarupa understanding, and there is another form of understanding which is understanding of the formless, which would be Sachit understanding. And the understanding of the formless is accompanied with bliss and peace, harmony. So it's Satchitananda understanding, if you will. So this understanding of the formless is the experience of the formless. Formless meaning there are no manifestation, meaning nirvikalpa, right? No vikalpas. So that's the nirvikalpa samadhi, the real meaning of it is this understanding of our true nature. It takes place only in Turiya, in the fourth state, right? When there are no perceptions.
So I have some questions around the world of objects. So, you know, I've read the world is illusory. The world is a product of the mind. But when you say run the experiment...
I don't say that.
No. But yes, that's why I said I read about it. I read it that way. But when you say run the experiment of being and feeling and thinking as universal consciousness, how do I, as consciousness, see the world? How do I consider the world?
You mean conceptually or perceptually?
Perceptually. So
I know.
No, right. So I see this perception, which is perception of perception. But to consciousness, is it illusory? Is it so? Because you also say everything is made of consciousness. So I'm trying to reconcile everything that's made of consciousness. There's a world of objects. So from consciousness standpoint, what does it mean?
Well, from consciousness standpoint, there are no objects.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
There are objects only from the vantage point of the mind, when the mind reflects upon the experience of the world and then creates a representation of it in which there are objects. In other words, there is no real the mind separates the objects, but in fact nothing comes separate from anything in our experience. It's an abstraction. The image I use, okay, we make a distinction between the head of the cat and the tail of the cat, but for the cat, that's only the cat, right? That's only me, right?
Okay, so that's from the
A cat is not born with labels attached to the tail saying tail and to the head saying, these labels are abstractions.
Right.
And the abstraction, in other words, the naming, the nama comes after the rupa, right? The naming comes, you first needs to have the perception, but the perception itself is one, right?
So that's from the mind perspective. Now, from consciousness, when you say there's only consciousness, I guess I'm trying to understand, when you say everything is made of consciousness. Please explain.
Well, first we have to discriminate, and that's very important, between consciousness and mind. Because as long as we conceive consciousness intellectually, right, as being some kind of mind, we are limiting it to mind stuff, meaning thought-like, perception-like experiences. And therefore, we don't allow the possibility for consciousness to be matter-like stuff. Okay? So it's important to not see consciousness as mind stuff. The reality of mind, consciousness, is not made of mind. And I repeat that, that's important. The reality of mind is not made of mind. The reality of matter is not made of matter. These two symmetric statements make it possible for the reality of mind and the reality of matter to be the same reality. Advaita, only one reality, right? So that's very important.
So, yeah. So when I'm in not knowing, right, so I don't know what I am. Like you said, the borderlessness, but I don't know that I'm universal, but I don't know what I am. Then, but there's perception. So perception itself is an object.
That's a concept that comes after the perception.
True.
At the time of perception, the perceiver and the perceived are one. They cannot be distinguished. Therefore, the true nature of perception, of a thought or of any perception, is consciousness.
Why do you say perceiver and the perceiver and perception is the same?
Yeah, because in fact, for perceiving to take place, there need to be a connection between the perceiver and the perceived, right? Mm-hmm. So no matter how we define the perceived, they have to be one in that sense that for this perception, which is an interaction between the perceiver and the perceived to take place, they have to share a common reality. Therefore, the reality of the perceiver and the reality of the perceived are the same, is the same. And that's that which we forget in ignorance in our perception, because in our perception we have been taught to constantly separate. So that's our mode, our default mode of perceiving, to use a term of IT or whatever. Our default mode of perception is separative perception. Whereas it should be simply an option that we choose when we need to reflect upon things. But our default mode would be the innocent mode in which we don't separate. Because this innocent mode, this childlike mode, or this, I often call it the artistic view, is the one which is the most consistent with the universality of consciousness, in which there is no separation between the perceiver and the perceived, and that's the view of the world that the newborn has.
So then, it seems like in that mode, perception, the perceived is just like an image on a mirror. It's just there, and that's it. The perceiver being the mirror, and
in fact, we, in this divided mode of perceiving, we establish a separation between the objects. Some perceptions are labeled as me, for instance, a bodily sensation or a thought. And other perceptions, for instance, the image of an object in front of us, are labeled as not me. So that's when this division comes in. The duality is created by a superimposition onto the experience of perceiving of this division, which is non-existent in the experience of perceiving itself. This division comes after the fact. And so, in our experience, therefore, there is never duality. Duality is never experienced. You see? Because at the time of perceiving, there is no duality between the perceived and the perceiver, but then there is a thought that comes that establishes this separation, but this thought, in turn, is one with the perceiver, right? It's not separate from the perceiver, so it comes after the fact, but in the moment itself, there is always non-duality. You see?
I think that's where I was, there seems to be this conflict where, where we say, I'm the space in which these objects appear, the sensations and the thoughts. So there is that separation.
Yeah, but there is no separation. In other words, duality is never experienced. Duality is a pseudo experience, but it's never a real experience.
Yeah, and it seems like that is the efforting part, creating the duality. Because like you said, if just perception happens and that's it, but then that next thought comes that creates the separation, and that requires effort.
Even that, it depends. This separation may be effortless if it is used as a tool, if provided the default state is this innocent perception, and now if you are asked a question, what's the color of the flower, you see, then you look at the flower and you can enter a conversation with someone about the flower, pretending that we are human beings looking at the flower. You see, but what matters really is what is our deep understanding of what is true. We can talk about the alleged flower and many people here, and have interpersonal connections and talk about all of that. That's fun, that's fine. Provided deep inside a shift has taken place that we know that is true on the surface only, but that at the deepest level of reality, it ceases to be true. It was just a model. It was just to enjoy the show, but that at the deepest level there is only one reality.
Thank you.
I hope I'm not rehashing of Suji's conversation here, but
We are constantly rehashing here.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Okay, cool. So, for the 1001st time, I feel like I am perceiving from, oftentimes, I feel like I'm perceiving from a blank state, just kind of this, I can kind of sink into this, it's almost a sense of void, and it's preferable to what I was perceiving from before, because I feel like the grosser sense of separation and suffering doesn't have anything to kind of latch onto. But I think, in those moments, my experience is very much, perceiving objects from a sense of, a blank state. It's still a state, right? So I don't know. I acknowledge that there's a duality there, but
Ask yourself, why am I asking this question? What is it that I am seeking? And you see that you are trying to get rid of something which is unpleasant by asking this question. And something which is unpleasant, this unpleasantness really is the core of the illusion of being a separate entity. So, as long as we try to eliminate unpleasant stuff, we are not really seeking the truth. We are kind of doing more of the same of that which we have been doing for a very, very long time, which is to believe that if I acquire something, or if I lose something, if I acquire something like a big, or if I lose something like a contraction I have, or that will be the solution. But obviously, this line of approach doesn't work because we have tried for so long, our parents, our ancestors have tried for so long without any result that it is very unlikely that it will work in our case. Nevertheless, people still keep applying the old recipes of their ancestors that they know full well didn't work in their case, in the hope that they are working in their own case. So that which works is to understand. And to understand means to seek the truth. To seek the truth is very different from seeking relief. And then, having had a glimpse of this truth, some form of understanding, which I'm certain you have had, just stick to it. Become your own teacher. Stick to it first in the moments when this unpleasantness is not present, right? When you are more available. But then when this unpleasantness comes to you, don't try to put a Band-Aid on it or to anesthetize it, but see that it has its origin in the belief at that moment. to be a separate entity. The very fact that we try to get rid of something is the signature that at that signature of ignorance is a signature that at that moment we believe to be this human being who is having this problem. And the real problem is not the problem this human being is having. The real problem is that we believe to be this human being.
Yeah.
You see, the real problem is not the problem this human being is having, but it is that we consciousness believe to be this human being who is having a problem.
Right. And
So when you get rid of the belief to be this human being who is having this problem, the problem goes down the drain with the human being, right?
right.
So in the beginning we understand that, and almost immediately the belief to be a human being comes back, right? But we have to be persistent, because then we have to go to the truth about us being a human being, meaning a human body mind.
Right.
You have to revisit that again and again and ask ourselves questions about, yeah, but what is the real me? What is my reality?
Mm-hmm.
What is the experience of my reality? You see that the experience of your reality, of our reality, is consciousness.
Right.
So the experience of consciousness within, that which is extraordinary, is that at the very center of our humanity, if you will, is the center of the universe. Center being taken in the essence, the reality. Our reality and the reality of the universe is the same. So the experience of our reality, which is the experience of consciousness, is also the experience of reality of the universe. We have to be open to that. In the beginning it seems very far-fetched. But you know, not as far-fetched as black holes.
So be open to the possibility that, I'm trying to repeat what you just said, be open to the possibility that my essence is the essence
of the universe. Yes, because you are part of the universe, therefore you have with the universe in common the same reality.
Thank you.
Good morning, Francis.
Good morning, Francis.
Thank you. So I want to talk for a moment about what I'm going to call the game of consciousness. I feel like, well, one of your games is to play tennis over and over and over and over to improve it as best you can. One of the games I play is drumming. I practice drumming over and over and over to the best I can. I feel like the game of consciousness is...
Both are very stupid games.
I feel like with consciousness is eternally and infinitely creative and abundant in many forms, and I feel like situations keep arising in which ultimately it's about expanding and deepening love. Would you agree?
Yeah. We usually understand love in the context of relationships among human beings, but it's also love for the creation as a whole. You see, love for the manifestation. But ultimately, even love for the manifestation is love for that which sustains the manifestation and that which emanates it. So what we love in the things we love is the reality, the consciousness. And since it is everywhere, every moment, anywhere, is an opportunity for love or gratitude or contemplation. We can give different words to that. Even people who are in ignorance, they have this feeling sometimes. In the morning, the air is pure, they feel a fragrance of some flower, and they say, oh, wow, so sweet to be alive.
Thank you.
I had a follow-on question to Vishal's there when you were explaining this, be open to the fact that you're the reality of the... But isn't that a conceptual thing?
What?
Being open to the fact that you're the reality of the... you consciousness are the reality of the universe. So isn't that a conceptual thing?
Oh, when I express it, it's a conceptual thing, yes. But the experience is not conceptual.
How do I experience?
Yes, the reality of consciousness. Ask yourself, in this moment, would it be possible at any other moment for consciousness not to be present? Experientially. In other words, is there any uncertainty whatsoever regarding the existence of consciousness?
Right. But that is telling me that I am real. But it's not telling me...
It's telling you that consciousness is real, yes.
Yeah, but it's not telling me that I am the reality of the universe.
Yeah, it is not telling you that it is the only reality. Right?
Yeah.
Now, it is not telling it to you, but it is not telling you the opposite either.
Right.
So then, there are two paths that are open to you. I call them the path of the mathematician or the philosopher and the path of the physicist. The path of the mathematician or the philosopher is to remain, to ponder with all the might of your intellect this notion of a plurality, to explore the possibility of a plurality of realities. That ask yourself the question, is it possible that there would be many realities? One of which then would be me as a consciousness, but there would be many others. And then the first thing we have to do is to be open to the possibility that among those realities, we could divide them in two sets. In one set would be realities that have never interacted with our reality and will never interact. So these realities, we can totally disregard them, because for all practical purposes, they have nothing to do with us. We never know about them. They are just figments of our imagination. For all practical purposes, they are null and void, right? So then we have to consider realities that are different from our reality, but with which we can interact. And now the question is, if we interact with one of those realities, it implies that these two realities, me and the reality with which I'm interacting, for instance, the reality of the universe which I perceive, and the perceiving of the universe is an interaction. So, to make our conversation a little bit more concrete, me versus the universe, right? The physical universe, as an example. These two realities, in order for this perception to be real, we have to assume that there is an interaction between my reality and the reality of the universe. And for interaction to take place, the two elements that are interacting have to belong to a common reality, right? And then this common reality of me as the perceiver, for instance, and of the universe as being the perceived, would imply that the reality I was assuming to be up until that moment was not my true reality. That my true reality is this unified, all-encompassing reality. And therefore, this unified, all-encompassing reality must be the reality that perceives, right? And therefore, that's the definition of consciousness in Francis' book, right? The reality that perceives, which is the real me, because I am the one who is perceiving, right? So that's the first path. That's the path of, through the sheer power of the intellect, we reach an area of universal ideas, if you will, and beyond that, we reach the absolute. In the other path is the path of the physicist, the experimental path, which I often describe, which is to check it out. To check it out, asking the question through our various experimentations, is consciousness universal? Or is the reality which perceives the same as the reality which is perceived? If that's the case, there should be phenomenal events that could enable me to discriminate, to find out.
So both these paths really are taking you to an understanding, right? It is, it's not immediately experiential, right?
The experimental path, the outcome of the experiment may be delayed somehow. At least the phenomenal outcome. Because this experiment has two outcomes. One which is phenomenal, which is serendipitous events happening in the world as a result of our experimentation. But there is another one which is noumenal, which is an increased sensation of peace and connection and harmony within, which is immediate. So, in the other case, on the other path, it's a little bit the same, because we go through a succession of concepts that purify themselves and finally lead to an experience of understanding. So already in the conceptual phase, already there is a feeling of harmony that we experience. And then with a final release in the moment of understanding.
Yeah, so it always seems like there's, at least in the beginning, you go through that, the intellectual process, and then slowly that, and then you reach the understanding, and then it just solidifies, so you don't have to go through that process.
Right. Then once, yeah, absolutely. Once you have, yes, it's like in mathematics. Once you have proves verifies through a mathematical proof a theorem, then you don't need to every time to prove it. You just use it. Yeah.
Thank
you. Francis, so here, the remembrance of my being consciousness, perceiving consciousness, or reality perceiving reality is more present. And then when I'm not here, and everyone is, the interaction with people is mostly object to object. So is it correct then, is it good to remind myself?
Yes.
Yeah. And then sometimes the experience of the peace and happiness comes.
Yes, it's good to, before an interaction, to take a kind of deep spiritual breath and to place yourself in this place, both intellectually by being open to the possibility that you are interacting with yourself, with the same consciousness, but also, perhaps more importantly, on a physical level, to immerse yourself in the world as a body, to be completely open-bodied, so that you feel that whoever or whatever you are dealing with is part of you. You see, that's even more important, because it's a shortcut through all the intellectual preparation that you do. Both paths are good. The first is not as powerful, as direct, as efficient as the latter.
Yeah, I like that. And you were mentioning to remind ourselves or be aware that, say, I'm not a human being. So if there is physical pain in the body, and I'm not a human being, then how do I look at that?
You go to the doctor. You take Advil. You are the manager of your body. In other words, let's assume that your body is your baby and that you are the mother. What do you do if the baby is in pain? You take the baby to the doctor. You right?
Francis, I was reading along this line about the life of Ramakrishna, and
you check the diapers.
And hopefully not, but and Ramakrishna had throat cancer at the end of his life, and one of his devotees asked him, why did the enlightened have pain? And his answer was, where there is form, there is pain. And I was wondering if you agree with that.
Where there is form, there are sensations.
Sensations, yeah. Okay, that's easy.
Francis, I had more of a clarification about, you often speak of the nested, you just were speaking of the kind of the nested realities, and as soon as there is an interaction between one assumed reality and another one, there is a unity between
I don't know,
them.
I'm sorry, because I was stuck when you say nested realities, because nested realities evokes for me the image of Russian dolls, you know? So like, or like an onion, you know, you never reach a center. So that, I never use that now.
Yeah, that...
With me,
I
the
guess,
buck stops quite early.
yeah, I could use different words. I guess that was just something I used. To see that my reality is the universal reality. To see that my reality is the universal reality. What I understand is that you guide us to see that at the moment there is an interaction between my reality and any other reality, there is a unity between them because of that very interaction. And I feel like I understand that. Maybe the understanding is not full. I read something else that kind of sounds similar, and I guess I wanted to check with you if there was a connection. And what I read was this something from Meister Eckhart, where he said that the effect is contained within the cause. And there was something about it that kind of clicked like an intuition, that makes sense, that the effect is already within the cause. And somehow that understanding for me connects with what you say about this interaction.
Yes, because it's simply just as you realize that there is a connectivity throughout space. There is also the same connectivity throughout time, or continuity, if you will. So when you look at the causal aspect of it, it's the understanding that it is only an operation of the intellect that separates the cause from the effect, as if such separation existed. But if such separation would exist, the cause could not bring about the effect, right? The very fact that the cause has the power to produce an effect implies a connection between the cause and the effect. And if the cause and effect are connected, they are like the head and the tail of the cat. You see, so it's about continuity. You see, reality is absolutely continuous. The discontinuity is only an appearance. So then we make the distinction between the cause and the effect. But the universe doesn't come with labels attached, you know, this event is the cause, that event is the effect. It's a view which has its usefulness when we want to manipulate things in the world, you know, yeah. It's a way of thinking, it's a model which has its usefulness, but it's not a universal model.
Yeah, thank you. I had one related question to the earlier conversation. when you were saying to stay open to the possibility of being the reality, I feel more and more that somehow I'm being, in my experience, tested, whether it's in the area of health or what I call human desires. And each time what is becoming always accessible is somehow my sincerity to not being human in those moments. And I just wanted to check with you I feel like I have to surrender.
At least the sincerity to be open to the possibility that consciousness is not human.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily to believe it sincerely, because a belief is never sincere, 100% sincere. It is only not knowing which is 100% sincere. In every belief there is something fishy about it. There is a moment when we have abdicated our freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You see? So in fact it's only absolute agnosticism which is honest. That's what, in a sense, what we do here is very far from religion, at least from religion as we construe it in the West, as a set of beliefs that you have to believe this and that and that and that, about Moses, about Jesus, Virgin Mary, Mohammed, whatever. You have to believe a lot of stuff.
Yes, I feel maybe I should use, it's definitely not a belief, it's more of a conviction that is available.
Yeah. And even, to say, well, why not go back to not knowing? Because whatever, the beauty is that the lab is always here when I can conduct an experiment to verify. So I don't need to create really concepts in my head about consciousness being universal. All I have to do is know consciousness is always present, so it's always open for the investigation. The lab, I'm always in the lab. So the idea is to live my life as a constant experimentation on consciousness or on reality. You see, it's very, and then to enjoy the outcome of the experiments.
Thank you.
Hi, Francis. Kind of follow up on what we've been talking about. I came here 8 years ago, and what really resonated for me was to be the physicist. And that's what I've done. And my life has gotten profoundly better. I was just wanted to hear your response, because I thought it was similar to his question, which was, and yet I still have this desire to be the mathematician. And every time I do, it's trouble for me. I was just wondering if you could respond to that.
It's because you feel that you are missing something. But that would be true if the mathematician and the physicist in this metaphor would reach different shores, but no, they reach the same territory. They reach the same place. There is no difference. So then, what it boils down to is which means of transportation do you prefer? Some people like traveling by sea. They are seasick. Other people are afraid of flying. So just choose your means of transportation according to your own, knowing that you will reach America at the end anyway. Uh-oh. God, we have some time. Tom. So it is by hearing over and over again the teachings that one becomes established in peace and happiness. Yes, and also by doing our best to live in accordance with the teachings, to hear the teachings, to think about the teachings, and to act according to our understanding of the teachings. So, in order to understand the teachings, you need to hear the teachings, you need to meditate on the teachings, read the understanding, and whatever you understand, to act on it, to apply it in your life. Jeroen. Many thanks for explaining that consciousness is the one deciding for ignorance for each body-mind last Saturday. It was a very revealing statement for me, which also helps me understand better your statements about grace and to better realize everything is one. My first question this weekend is about the mind. What happens to the mind when the body dies? Does the mind also disappear? Or could it persist to later on get born in a new body? Reincarnation possibility. For when the mind is purely a tool for consciousness, without personal characters, qualifications, memories, then it probably will die with the body. The answer I usually give is that in relation to reality, this adventure here with bodies, minds, and the universe is only one of the possibilities. It's only one of the possibilities that we, as this universal power, create. all I can say is that because it is our own creation, there is nothing to worry about. And regarding what happens to the mind when the body dies, whatever happens to the mind, nothing happens to the mind. Actually, nothing happens. Because to say that something happens to the mind would assume that the mind is real. We don't worry upon waking up from a dream, during which we had interacted with a friend in the dream called John. Upon waking up from the dream, we stop worrying about what happened to John. And moreover, what happened to John's mind. Even if John died during the dream. So this question comes from some kind of forgetting that consciousness creates this dream, and that in doing so, it has absolute freedom over the outcomes. Why would consciousness, which is absolute freedom, be bound by its own decrees, by its own laws? Even if he says, okay, the law is that if you are a Hindu, well, you choose to believe in reincarnation, therefore you are going to reincarnate. Perhaps. But what seems to me to be more important to understand, that since we are the creator of all this extraordinary display, there is nothing to worry about. And that whatever is going to happen is whatever we will choose as universal consciousness. It will come out of our freedom. Nothing will be imposed onto us. We may decide to go on a new journey. I keep reading. My second question is about the ego. I think the source of ego lies in the sense of being separate, a separate I, and so resides in consciousness, in the consciousness part that is in ignorance, chosen for by consciousness itself, as you explained last week, and not in the mind. Is that correct? Are ego and mind two separate things? Well, ego refers to the specific qualities of a human body-mind in my book. This human body-mind is part of the manifestation. So the ego is therefore part of Maya, just as the mountains, the planets, the animals, the trees, the forests, etc. That would be my definition of the ego. The particular specs of a given human body-mind. It has to be distinguished from ignorance, which is the belief that I consciousness is a byproduct of this body-mind. So usually the term ego is used with the meaning of ignorance by some teachers or by some translators. And it is not too good because it creates in the truth seeker the impression that the ego is something, is an object that exists and that has somehow to be destroyed. So it gives the ego, this independent entity, a reality which it never had. So that's why I don't really use the term ego as part of the spiritual teaching. I use the term ignorance, which is much more proper, which is the identification of consciousness with the specific quality of a given body-mind. Vikrant. Is the reality of you and the reality of me one, or it is the same? It is one. When I say the same, I mean the very same. I don't mean that these are similar realities. I mean there is only one reality, which is both your reality and my reality. So I hope that was clear. So he goes on. Same implies it is the same element, but one means there is no distinction between you and me. For example, water in an ocean could be the same as water in a bucket, but it's not necessarily one. One implies something similar to space that is seen from two windows. It may seem different from two windows, but it is one, not the same. Yes, so I think I have answered this question, yes. Dory. Please speak of empathy. Webster Dictionary defines it as follows: the imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object so that the object appears to be infused with it. This definition of Webster is complete bullshit. I mean, Mr. Webster had a big job to define all of these words. So he could devote only a small amount of time for each of them, and no matter how smart he was, you know, he couldn't be perfect in all of his definitions. So we have to have some indulgence and to show empathy to Mr. Webster. But I don't feel bound by his definition. So I go on. Does realization necessarily favor the capacity to imagining feelings that one does not actually have? That's the problem with the definition. To imagine feelings that one does not necessarily have. I mean, that's the job of the actor. The job of the actor is to imagine feelings that he doesn't really have. To be in love with the lady he's shooting the movie with, whereas in real life they always fight each other and this. So he goes on. So the short answer to this question, does realization necessarily favor the capacity to imagining feelings that one does not actually have? No, because only good actors would be realized. And no, doesn't favor that. He goes on, when a person is going through chronic suffering related to past events and constantly dwells on them, I find myself unable to empathize or even feel compassion. I become sometimes critical and even offensive towards a person, especially that I've been through extreme situations myself. Please talk about how truth favors empathy. So, empathy etymologically means to feel inside. So, in fact, the real word for that would be sympathy. Because sympathy means to feel with the person, meaning to feel the same as the person. So, etymologically, sympathy is closer, would be a better word for purist, for Hellenist purist, than empathy. And sympathy, etymologically, that is the Greek version of compassion. Compassion, etymologically, means the same thing. To feel with a person, to feel the way a person feels. And actually, it doesn't mean only to feel pain when they are in pain. It means also to feel joy when they are in joy, to feel pleasure when they feel pleasure, etc. It means to feel like the other feel. And we know that we have mirroring neurons that have equipped us with this extraordinary possibility to sympathize, to feel the way the other person feels. And someone who has the ability to feel the way another person feels is called sympathetic, right? And in French, I don't know in English, but in French, sympathetic, it's equivalent to likable. In other words, this ability to show compassion, to feel the way someone else feels, makes this behavior likable. So the question is what it is that facilitates this process of empathy/sympathy. If I am full of my own garbage, meaning here feeling, there is very little room to resonate with other people's feelings. Therefore, we will show true sympathy, true empathy, to the extent that we are not too busy with our own feelings, with our own problems, with our own fears and desires. So the empathy really is the quality of emptiness, openness, which of course, yes, comes with the non-identification of consciousness with the body. But it is certainly not an imaginative projection of a subjective state into an object so that the object appears to be infused with it. Sorry, Mr. Webster. Carl, I've noticed that since the last 3 years, the perspective evolves very quickly. It's strange in that if I watch one of our satsangs from 3 months ago, it seems or feels like years ago. So much happening so fast, with no ceiling to the wonder of existing. I suspect this is a property of real existing. Can you speak to that? I think the ongoing experiments are constantly delivering truth, and a kind of event horizon or breaking away is happening. It reminds me, your comment reminds me of something my teacher told me, which happened to him after meeting his teacher in India. When he met his teacher in India, he was already in his 40s. And his teacher also was in his 40s. Actually, his teacher was a few years younger than him. And he told me 6 months after having my first meeting with my teacher, I realized that my life, that I had changed, I had undergone a much bigger transformation within these 6 months than during the first 40 years of my life. So, which tells me that this symptom you are describing is a good one. Luciana, about serendipity. It is the benevolent universe that stops obeying my orders and looks after me, because I ask so. It is the universe that, transformed into the cosmic dream by a glimpse of myself, gives and receives trust, love, and gratitude. But this is also the universe that, relentlessly obeying my orders to conform to ignorance, remains largely unaffected by the serendipitous responses it is called to give. So even when I know I am the universe, it still surprises me the way it simultaneously obeys two opposite orders, completely and yet inconspicuously, so that everything changes and nothing does. So serendipity must be the way I move, the hidden gems that I spontaneously forget to have left behind, and spontaneously discover under the most unlikely set of events. In these happy games I play, serendipity must then be both divine trace and divine surprise. Would you not say, then, that surprise is also a noumenal quality? Certainly, yes, definitely. Wouldn't a moment of surprise be similar to a moment of understanding? Yes, in that sense that it suspends the mind. It kind of propels us into the background. In that it is also an interval in which it seems to be I experience myself without object. Exactly. Right on in your conjecture. Carlo, I have a strong intuition that the underlying reality of myself must be the same as the underlying reality of the world. And this intuition of a single reality is supported by reason, as you have often demonstrated. The experience of limitless awareness in the absence of objects has become more accessible to me, whether spontaneously or through investigation of what I take myself to be. But so far, there have so far been only a few glimpses where the perceived world, usually experienced as consisting of separate objects which are separate from me, has been experienced in ways which have not fitted with this usual way of perceiving. I don't know how genuine these glimpses are, and whether imagination has been at work. So I would like to describe them. On 2 occasions, when loved ones have died, I have experienced a sense of an all-pervading essence of life through everything, whose quality was of pure love. When walking in nature, I once experienced a sense of nothing and everything together. At a recent Rupert retreat, my experience when looking at a scene was that that was there was here. At an Helen yoga lesson, I became aware for the first time of bodily feelings appearing and disappearing in and as myself as unlimited consciousness. I think these glimpses are my only experiential indication so far that what I am and what the universe is might be identical, but their quality seems rather different from the experience of consciousness without object. And this apparent separation puzzles me. Can you suggest how to resolve this and take the investigation further? The separation between this experience and the experience of consciousness without object is only phenomenal. Meaning that in one case there are no phenomena present, in the other case there are phenomena present. But the nominal experience is exactly the same. Because in both cases, everything is me. Once we have experienced in the consciousness without object experience our reality and our total independence, whatever then when the universe arises in us, it is seen as simply being made of the stuff we are made of. So, something, however, that we have to understand it is this. As you talk about this experience, or these experiences, you use a concept of them based on some recollection. And recollections are recollections of the objective or phenomenal part that was present. And as I have tried to show to you, the differences lie only in the phenomenal side, in the phenomenal part of these experiences. When we don't, but in most cases, when we have this experience of non-separation, we don't necessarily conceptualize it by telling ourselves, oh, see, 1 minute ago, I was in non-separation. I was experiencing what Francis, Rupert, or Hélène talk about. So be open to the possibility that as we get used to it, this experience of non-separation becoming our natural condition, it is left unnoticed by the mind, There is no need to noticing it by the mind, as I often say, because when we are happy, we are too busy being happy, so that there is no room for thinking, I am happy. Alfonso, it is about understanding experientially the non-locality of consciousness in space. When I reflect on this body, evolving over time, when it was 5 years old, 10, 20, 30, etc., and see that an element of my experience has always remained the same, the beingness, I can intuit the non-locality of consciousness in time, exactly. I can see time as a mental superimposition as a fiction of movement that appears to an ever-present, unmoving presence. However, I have a difficulty in treating the non-local aspect of consciousness in space. My sense is that wherever the body moves, consciousness or I moves with it. This means I think that I have a harder time disidentifying consciousness from the point of view from which I experience sensory perceptions, which takes me back to the metaphor you gave last time, which was this. Consciousness is a security guard in a department store that is looking at all the TV screens that show what every camera in the store is seeing. Each camera would represent a body mind. But then, if I am using non-local consciousness, shouldn't I be able to see what other body minds are seeing? Just like the security guard is able to see what all the cameras are seeing. The short answer to the last question is, how do you know you are not seeing it simultaneously? But I would like to go back to the first part of your question, in which you say it's easy for me to understand the continuity of consciousness over time, but I have a hard time being open to the possibility of the continuity of consciousness over space. The reason is due to the presence of psychological memory. We remember our past, and these memories seem to create an objective continuity to our experience. In other words, we remember a scene from the past, for instance, my toothbrush on my vanity last night, and this morning, it is the same toothbrush. I recognize that it is the same toothbrush due to memory. If I had Alzheimer's, it would be a new toothbrush on that morning. But so, from the sameness of the image of the toothbrush, we infer the sameness of the consciousness that perceives the toothbrush over time. But the first thing we have to realize is that this inference is totally bogus. The sameness of that which is perceived doesn't give us any clue about the sameness of the perceiving entity. We have to see that. In other words, memory doesn't play, in fact, any part in the recognition of the continuity of consciousness over time. But now, let's assume you have Alzheimer's, no memories from the past. So the continuity over time, or the continuity across space, would now stand on an equal footing. Because the advantage that apparently continuity over time had was the presence of memory. First, I've shown that it was a fallacy to believe that. And then, by eliminating in this Gedanken experiment the role played by memory, we are in the now. We have the continuity of the now, which is not distinguishable. The continuity in time of consciousness from the continuity in space. Because the discontinuity in space of consciousness is inferred from the diversity of the locations that are appearing in consciousness. But just as the sameness of the toothbrush was a fallacy, was just as the argument according to which the sameness of the toothbrush between the evening and the morning was pointing to the sameness of consciousness was a fallacy, in the same way, the diversity of the landscape, of the scenery that are present in consciousness over space is a fallacy as a proof that consciousness travels in space and is localized in space. In fact, space is localized in consciousness in the same way as time is localized in consciousness. The next questions next week. Sound distorted. Bad internet connections, sorry about that. So we'll send...
We'll have to post it because...
Yeah, we post this dialogue. Thank you.